Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Grantwood in Focus presentation. Today is a special one because we are joined by Tara Templeman from the History Center. Tara is the curator and collection manager at the History Center, a role they have loved for over 6 years. They received 2 Bachelor of Science degrees in biology and earth and planetary sciences at the University of New Mexico, graduating cum laude with a certificate in museum studies. They received a Master's of Science, Museum, and Field Studies from the University of Colorado. Tara's passion for the museum field is in storytelling. While much of their formal training has been in collections management, they are most interested in getting people excited about history through quirky programming and relevant exhibitions. Tara currently serves as the president of the Iowa Museum Association and History Day chair for Leadership for 5 seasons. In their free time, Tara loves hiking, tap dancing, reading, and working as chase crew for hot air balloon pilots. So thank you so much for being here, Tara, and I will turn it over to you to tell us about Grantwood Seriously Silly.
Thank you, Julia. Happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Everybody can see that? Okay, excellent. I am excited to be here with you today and share some stories from our current exhibit at the History Center, which is all about Grant Wood's sense of humor. I do want to start by saying I am not an art historian, and I also would not say that I am an expert on Grant Wood, but I am a historian, so I might have a different approach to Grant Wood's artwork than some other people, and I think that that is fun. So if there are other things that people know about and stories they want to share that are more about the artist side of Grant Wood, that would be wonderful. I talk a little bit more about Grant Wood the man than the artist, but I think that's great because we're talking about his sense of humor specifically. And I also am a big believer in the power of whimsy and that being a necessary part of life. I want to feel connected to the past and to my community. And I feel that doing that through a sense of humor is one of the most direct ways to forge connections. So I didn't know Grant Wood, of course, but my research has led me to believe that he would have agreed that a sense of whimsy is an important part of life. And so I will be telling you some of the more whimsical and goofy stories about Grant Wood. This exhibit didn't happen through my work alone. I don't have the ability to create art exhibitions from our collection because we are a history museum. Through the generosity of Joe Coffey, Co-College, the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, the Cedar Rapids Community School District, the Grant Wood Art Colony, and Rennell specifically, this exhibit has been made possible. We also would not have been able to do it without our generous sponsors, Nancy A. Miller and David Meyer and Matthew McGrain. The exhibit will be at the History Center through June of this year. So if you haven't had a chance to come over and see it yet, you certainly do have some time to make it over. And I hope that you all will come over to see the exhibit. Grant Wood is best known for images that can feel calm, familiar, and deeply rooted in the Midwest. At first glance, his work can seem straightforward and sincere. Look more closely, and sometimes a different picture begins to emerge. This exhibition explores the ways that Wood shaped how he was seen both as an artist and a person. Through humor, performance, and carefully chosen imagery, he created public versions of himself that were reassuring, patriotic, and plain-spoken. At the same time, his art reveals tensions between appearance and reality, belonging and distance, admiration and critique. Across these works, humor plays many roles. Sometimes it's playful and self-directed, other times it is ironic, pointed, or quietly confrontational. Wood's paintings invite viewers to enjoy what looks familiar while also questioning what lies beneath the surface. Two of the examples that I like here are Honorary Degree from 1938 and Return from Bohemia from 1935 that just show kind of a deeper meaning and some humor infused in some of these artworks. I found this quote from Marvin Cohn in 1947 that really summed up a lot of what I was trying to do in this exhibit. Grant got a lot of downright fun pretending that he believed such things. He had his tongue in his cheek lots of the time. His mother used to chuckle over his off notions and make fun of him sometimes when he'd come out with some preposterous idea. So there are several examples in this exhibit of some of his preposterous ideas, some in his artwork and some in his daily life. So, how did this exhibit even come to be? It started with a story of Percy Heavythinker. I received a research request from a reporter at the Gazette who was interested in information about the shooting range that used to be in the basement at McKinley. McKinley was a junior high school originally. Now it's McKinley STEAM Academy. Um, so I received this request and I started digging into the yearbooks looking for evidence about this structure that used to be in the basement of McKinley. And I came across this really interesting story about Percy Heavythinker and specifically a mask that Grant Wood made while he was a teacher at McKinley. So the 1923 yearbook is where this story originally came from. Grant Wood at that time was the art teacher, and so he has drawn kind of a doodle of himself that made it onto the cover of the McKinley Mirror, which was the yearbook. And then he was drawing individual portraits of each of the students at McKinley. And in this last row, he only had three students. And so instead of leaving the page partially blank, he invented a student who never existed at all, named him Percy Heavythinker, and included a Bible verse here about Percy and what his value system would have been. Now, this is already a little bit of a joke and a small Easter egg that maybe some of the students would have noticed and some students would not have noticed, and that could have been the end of the joke, but it wasn't. By 1925, so not even 2 years after the 23 yearbook, Percy Heavythinker is the cover of the yearbook, and the entire point is featuring Percy Heavythinker's stamp photograph album. So this is from a time when reproducing photographs was very expensive, and so students would exchange little pocket-sized versions of their photographs that could be pasted into the yearbook. So each student just had a box next to their name, and if you exchanged photographs with a person, then you would paste their photo into the yearbook. This yearbook that we have in our collection does have some photos pasted into it, but not one of Perfect Percy. At this point, there's all this lore around Percy and who he was. They say that he's the very first student who ever entered the school at McKinley, that he is kind to his teachers, that he gets perfect grades all the time. He's kind of a square, and the joke is in some ways that he is the antithesis of Grant Wood. He has all these traits that Grant Wood did not have. But it is also easy for the other students at McKinley to hate on Percy. And in some of the yearbooks after this, there's even notes about how students would do better to emulate Percy instead of leaving pins on his chairs. So he gets made fun of. The joke doesn't stop here either. Grant Wood goes on to create a mask, which does still exist and normally is on display at McKinley, although right now it is part of our exhibit. So this mask is something that students get to wear for good behavior or good grades in the class photos. So it becomes more of a joke within the staff of the McKinley Mirror, who wear it in almost every photo, but also general class photos. Someone is often wearing Percy Heavythinker. So throughout the 20s, you can see these class photos, and somebody in the front row is wearing this sort of creepy, goofy, fantastic mask, and I am so pleased that it still exists and that we can pull it out and put it on display. It is normally at a school, but not everyone can just walk into the school and ask to see Percy. So I'm excited that he is out in the public right now. So while Percy Heavythinker never walked the halls, his legend did. In fact, the mask is normally on display, and it's all thanks to Grant Wood's mischievous imagination. Percy attends the same school a century after he was created. And here in the very front row, sort of in a row all by himself is Percy Heavythinker in a 1927 photograph of all of the students at McKinley. And here, all of the mirror staff are holding fans, describing themselves as being fans of the mirror and sort of wiping their heads, which is a goofy joke anyway, but you can see Percy Heavythinker right there in the middle. When we're talking about Grant Wood as a teacher and his sense of humor at McKinley, I can't do that without mentioning the mourner's bench that Grant Wood created in 1921. So the story goes that he was asked to create a bench that would sit outside of the principal's office for students to sit on. And he did that, but the first bench that he created had a leather seat and was just a little bit too comfortable. So Miss Prescott, who was the principal, asked him to try again, and he took the joke pretty far, creating this caricature of an uncomfortable bench. The way of the transgressor is hard, and then all of these students up above are crying and dealing with the hard emotions of getting in trouble and being forced to sit outside of the principal's office. And this bench is fantastic. It is, as far as I know, permanently, although I suppose nothing is permanent, on display at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. So if you have not seen it, you certainly can see it there. So this is maybe my favorite Grant Wood work of all time. This is a drawing that Grant Wood did for the movement of a courthouse between Marion and Cedar Rapids. So originally, Marion was the county seat for Lynn County, and this was a big contentious issue trying to move the seat from Marion to Cedar Rapids. There is still a cannon in the city park in Marion, which is pointed at Cedar Rapids to this day as a result of this fight. Mostly as a joke at this point, but there really is a cannon that really is pointed in the general direction of Cedar Rapids. So Marion's first courthouse was built in 1842 and then was replaced in 1855. As the building aged and Lynn County grew, a new courthouse was needed to store important documents and protect them from potential fires. Cedar Rapidians began arguing that it was time to move the county seat to Cedar Rapids, the larger of the two cities. The matter was put to voters in 1919, and the fight that preceded the special election was brutal. 3 days before the election, the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette on November 1st ran a big drawing by artist Grant Wood of the Marion Courthouse in flames with the banner headline, "Courthouse Burns." A smaller subhead stated, "This is an imaginary scene, but in the present condition of the fire hazard, it may happen at any time." The courthouse never caught on fire. There was never a fire there. He was hired and paid by the Lynn County Publicity Committee on Courthouse Removal to create this drawing of the courthouse on fire and people just screaming in the street. Marion fought back, arguing that the Mays Island plot deeded to Lynn County for the new courthouse was an inadequate sandbar in the Cedar River. Lynn County voters on November 4th, 1919, chose Cedar Rapids as the new county seat by a 2-to-1 margin. But Marion voters turned out in huge numbers in a December 1920 special election to block the $1.3 million bond issue to build a new courthouse in Cedar Rapids. It was a heated campaign, with the president of the Lynn County Farm Bureau even suggesting voters, and this is a direct quote, "get together and push Cedar Rapids off the map." Cedar Rapids prevailed and won the passage of a $750,000 bond issue in November of 1922 to build a new courthouse and jail. Architect Joseph Royer designed the buildings, which opened in 1925. So you probably didn't know that Grant Wood had anything to do with the courthouse in Lynn County, but he absolutely did. Moving on to the next story, we have the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers, which was a play on the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Grant Wood's sense of humor shaped how he welcomed people to Iowa City. While teaching at the University of Iowa, he helped the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers, a private social club created to take care of visiting lecturers after their public talks. This combined hospitality, wit, and a strong appreciation for good company. The society grew out of the Times Club, which sponsored lectures for students, faculty, and townspeople. After formal events, society members made sure speakers were relaxed and well treated. Guests included writers, artists, and public figures such as Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, Langston Hughes, Thomas Hart Benton, and others who sometimes visited or stayed at Wood's home. Wood delighted in the theatrical side of the group. In 1933, he redecorated the room above Smith's Cafe on Dubuque Street, where the society met. He described the space as intentionally overdone in Victorian style, filled with floral wallpaper and eccentric furnishings. Photographs show Wood and his guests dressed in costume, fully embracing the joke. The Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers reveals another side of Wood. It shows an artist who valued friendship, performance, and generosity, and who believed that the ideas were best shared in an atmosphere of warmth, laughter, and a little mischief. So they took part of their work very seriously. They did send out questionnaires to each of the speakers who were invited, asking questions like, do you wish us to make hotel reservations, or do you wish to be entertained at a private home? Do you wish to be met at the train? If so, when do you expect to arrive? Do you wish to be undisturbed after your arrival, or may we take you for an automobile ride to see the university? So they definitely had serious questions for these presenters and really did want to make sure that they were comfortable. But they also were very goofy with their presenters. They had false beards and mustaches that they would put on, and they would have people pose all around this overly Victorian, sort of gaudy space, posing just for fun, just to be very goofy in all of these photographs. And it is quite an extensive collection of photographs that you can find in a couple of publications. So we have many of these on display. And in our exhibit, we also, of course, have some floral wallpaper up and some false facial hair so that if people would like to take photos in this style, they can do that. We also have this story that I think doesn't get told often enough about the chick and the cigarette. So, of course, Nan was Grant Wood's model in American Gothic, and people said all kinds of mean things about Nan and her appearance. There's a quote saying something about how she has a face that could sour milk. So Grant Wood thought that maybe Nan's feelings had been hurt by what people were stating, and so he offered to create Portrait of Nan as a way to make it up to her. And I am telling this story because we have a oral history interview with Nan where she tells the story, and that is part of the exhibit. So I feel pretty confident about the way that I'm telling it as being Nan's perspective. So that's how this came to be. And Grant Wood said that he wanted to repeat some of the colors. So the plum in her hand is supposed to repeat the color of the background, and the chick in her hand is supposed to repeat the color of her hair. Now, I think there are lots of other reasons why those specific items might have been selected, and I know an art historian would have a different thing to say about it. That is Nan's version of events in the oral history that we have. So apparently Nan liked chickens, and one year for Easter brought one home to the studio. And so the chick wandered around the studio, grew up there, and started to keep the same hours as the people. And Grant Wood had a prank that he liked to play where when he passed out cigarettes at a party, one of them was always a rubber cigarette. And so as he was distributing these one day, he dropped the rubber cigarette onto the floor, and the chick ran over and picked it up and started running around the room with the cigarette in its mouth. Well, after that, apparently the chick was excited anytime cigarettes came out and thought of them as a toy. And so he would make little chirping noises and get very excited anytime there was a cigarette. And so Grant Wood loved to make the joke that they had a chicken who loved cigarettes, and would pass out the cigarette to the chick on several occasions. One time with the chick even swallowing the entire cigarette. And in the oral history interview, Nan says that they thought that the chick would be a goner at that point, but he was completely fine and the cigarette didn't hurt him a bit. So she's laughing as she is telling this story. But I don't know that when you look at Portrait of Nan, you ever think of that as being a humorous piece of artwork, but the story behind it is quite humorous. Another one of my favorite bits by Grant Wood is that he had a broken left turn signal on his car. And instead of just repairing the turn signal, he created an arm and a system in his car where he could wind the pointer finger when he was making a left turn and then wind it back up after he had completed the turn, and that became his turn signal. We do have a transcript from the Radio Co program that is a recording between David Turner, who at that time was the president of the Cedar Rapids Art Association, and Marvin Cohn, who at that time was the head of the art department at Coe College, both longtime friends of Grant Wood. So they're having this conversation in 1947 about this very goofy turn signal that Grant Wood created. And they do ask about what happened to it. Neither one of them knows. They think that when Grant Wood sold the car, he had the turn signal go with the car. So we don't unfortunately have this. What we do have is a dingbat, which is on loan from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. It is from 1924, and it is the signage pointing people to Grant Wood's studio. So this arm is probably very similar to the one that Wood used on his car to replace that turn signal. I have no evidence to suggest that this is the exact arm, but if he had made something like it previously and then went on to use it again here, that would make lots of sense. Another bit that Grant Wood was always doing is this creation of a farmer persona. Grant Wood tried to build his art career in Europe, but it never took off the way that he had hoped. When he came back to Iowa, he chose to turn this setback into an advantage. He leaned into a farmer persona, playing up his rural roots, wearing overalls in press photos, and joking that all his best ideas had come to him while he was milking a cow. I think he really meant this as humor, but many people took him seriously. Grant Wood certainly grew up in rural Iowa, but his father died when he was a child. He was 10 years old, so he moved to Cedar Rapids pretty quickly after that. But he has been quoted as saying that the first years of his life shaped how he saw the world. Friends did describe Wood as cheerful on the outside, but troubled underneath. So this could be a slight nod to some of that. And I just loved this quote. I realized that all the really good ideas I'd ever had came to me while I was milking a cow, so I went back to Iowa. That just, it's such a goofy thing to say. That can't be exactly true, but it is very funny, and it certainly tells a good story. Part of Grant Wood's experience in Europe included bringing back some of what what he had learned there. Before we really get into this photo, I need to make sure that we all kind of have a baseline understanding of what the Beaux Art Ball is. So the Beaux Arts Ball is the annual costume ball traditionally given by the students of the, and I'm really sorry, my French is terrible, École Nationale Supérieure du Beaux-Arts in Paris in the spring. There were elaborately allegorical floats which circled the room at midnight and were judged by a panel. It is supposed to be a riot, a revival of paganism, and is, in a way, a hymn to beauty, a living explosion of the senses and the emotions, according to E. Barry Wall in Neither Pest Nor Puritan. It had a reputation for fabulously designed costumes, including nudity, behavior that is intriguing or attractively unconventional, cross-dressing, and high style, which all encouraged imitators in American cities. Believe it or not, this included Cedar Rapids. This photo is from a Gazette article in 1930, which does report on the Beaux Art Ball that took place at the Montrose Hotel in Cedar Rapids. So here is the actual article about the ball, and the photo quality here is not very good, so I did include that original photograph as well. So Grant Wood and many other notable Cedar Rapidians here are dressed up as the gods and goddesses of ancient Greek myths. And so they do go through and sort of say who each person is and who they are dressed as in this costume. Grant Wood being the second person from the left side here, dressed as Cupid. And I have heard a rumor that this photograph may have been used as part of the evidence when folks were trying to get Grant Wood fired from the university, stating that he had things in his life that would make him, would disqualify him from being a teacher. Sad sign of the times that that is what may have been used. I have never actually seen any of those documents that were submitted, so I don't know how true that is, but I certainly have heard that as a rumor. Grant Wood also loved to send Christmas greetings to people. Around 1925, while Wood was still working to establish his career, he created small plaster casts of his own face. The smiling caricature shows his dimples and round glasses. At one Christmas, family members remembered that he gave away between 50 and 100 of these tiny sculptures. Each one was gilded and handmade. By giving these gifts, Wood quite literally presented himself to his friends and relatives, offering his likeness along with his good wishes. A metal version of this object was produced many years later in the early 1970s and sold. So sometimes you still can find metal versions of these little Grant Wood faces. Wood also enjoyed sending playful holiday messages on paper. During one Christmas spent traveling in Europe, he sent a humorous postcard to his family back home. He cut out his own face and pasted it onto the body of a flying man carrying suitcases. The caption read, GDW, which wishes you a VMC and a HNY, short for a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. In a handwritten note, he added, I am going down to the Pope's for Christmas. That has a familiar sound. Wish you all were here with me. Love, Grant. So even his message was a little bit humorous there, talking about going down to visit his friend, the Pope. At that time, Wood was traveling from Paris to Rome for the holiday, so he would not be home. This is another item that is on loan from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and another one of my very favorites. It's a hospital sketch from 1919 when Grant Wood was receiving treatment for appendicitis. And I did find the newspaper article to verify that he had been in the hospital right around this same time. So this article is from May 13th, 1919, and he has drawn this lovely image of himself with his hospital gown open in the back. It says, and then he's written almost a limerick next to it. My nightgown has no rear, alas, my poise is badly shaken, without a stitch upon my back to face an operation. And it is interesting that alas and back don't rhyme. The next one we have here is Cat with Fox Rug. This is a very early Grant Wood work that I just think is really funny. This was created in 1905, and we have the cat encountering a fox rug here and being surprised, startled, maybe a little bit scared to see the fox all splayed out here. Now, not everything that Grant Wood created with some humor to it was cute. Grant Wood is often remembered for his quiet, careful images of American life, but his sense of humor could be sharp and even unkind. Although he claimed that most of his work was sincere, he admitted that one painting was deliberately satirical. That painting was Daughters of Revolution. Wood painted Daughters of Revolution in 1932 at his studio in Cedar Rapids. It shows three well-dressed women seated stiffly in front of a reproduction of Washington crossing the Delaware. Their smug expressions and rigid poses are intentional. Wood was responding to a personal slight. A few years earlier, he had designed a stained glass window for the Veterans Memorial Building, which was built in Germany by skilled craftsmen. Members of the local Daughters of the American Revolution objected to this choice, and the finished window received no public celebration. In the painting, Wood quietly turns the tables. The already famous patriotic image behind the women was actually painted by a German-born artist in Germany and one woman holds an English blue willow teacup, a pattern which draws information from Chinese art and culture. The details reveal Wood's satire. His realism makes the joke uncomfortable rather than playful. Wood once said that he would rather make people angry than have them dismiss his work as merely pretty. So this is the stained glass window, which probably most of you have seen at the Veterans Memorial, and then Daughters of Revolution. So he's not only poking fun at the hypocrisy of the Daughters of the American Revolution in this situation, but he also depicts them in, I would say, quite an unflattering way in this particular image. Now, this is not the only time Wood used humor with an edge. In an earlier work, he painted a nude portrait of Charles Manson, not that Charles Manson. He was the secretary of the Cedar Rapids Chamber of Commerce. Shown is Silenius, a figure from classic mythology associated with excess and indulgence. In this case, Charles is seated atop a large fruit basket and surrounded by pouring champagne. The figure transforms a civic leader into a symbol of vanity and excess. So you can see the actual Charles Manson here, and the depiction that Grant Wood created of him. At this point, he was the secretary of the Cedar Rapids Chamber of Commerce, and then is depicted here in quite a humorous way. Now, I've talked with Joe Coffey about this, and there's some evidence to suggest that Charles was so embarrassed by this that he ended up leaving town. He does end up leaving fairly soon after this, so that is possible. As a historian, I can't say, that that is 100% accurate, because I do not have the evidence to suggest that, but the dates do line up. So I do think that this is maybe unintentionally more hurtful than what Grant Wood was expecting to have happen. And then I did find this crest from the Cedar Rapids Chamber of Commerce, and I just thought it was interesting that that was also designed by Grant Wood. I do think there are a few circumstances where he is making fun of people, but he's also sort of in on the joke in that he's a part of some of these organizations. And so that will come up again later. But he must be taking the Chamber of Commerce somewhat seriously if he is designing the crest for the Chamber of Commerce, and then he's poking fun at some of the members, which I do think makes it seem a little bit less cruel than if he was not a member. In the oral history video, Nan also explains that she and Grant were not allowed to read fairy tales when they were younger. This was their father's rule, but their mother continued to enforce it after his death. This made me look at The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and at Parson Weems' Fable in a different way by understanding that as children, they were both told that they should only be reading things that were true. And so to encounter some of these legends later in life that are so blatantly false, it makes sense that Grant Wood would have been somewhat fascinated by that. We have the legend of Paul Revere's 1775 Midnight Ride, which is largely a myth that was created by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his 1860 poem, Paul Revere's Ride. It was designed to boost patriotism at that point, but contrary to popular belief, Paul Revere was not the Lone Rider, did not complete his journey to Concord, and never shouted, the British are coming." So largely a myth that was created at that time. I also love that the model for the horse that Paul Revere is riding here had to have been a rocking horse. It just looks just like that. The other interesting one is Parson Weems' Fable. So we know the story about Washington and the cherry tree, which was also pretty much completely invented to spur patriotism and to sell books. This was a biography of Washington that was written just after his death, but the story about the cherry tree was not included until the 5th edition of that book, so long after Washington's death. So Grant Wood is creating this artwork showing a very patriotic story about the history of the nation and one of the nation's founders, but he's also kind of poking fun at the story, using the grown-up Washington's head on the body of who's supposed to be a little boy in this particular portrait and in this story, but we also see Parson Weems featuring very prominently, and he has a curtain, very much like a theatrical performance. And so you are seeing the story that Parson Weems is creating, and he is pointing at the actors in this story that never really happened. And then I included this quote from 1940. I sincerely hope this painting will help reawaken interest in the cherry tree and other bits of American folklore that are too good to lose. In our present and unsettled times, when democracy is threatened on all sides, the preservation of our folklore is more important than is generally realized. So Grant Wood is very clearly stating that this is a made up story, but he is also kind of celebrating American folklore in this particular version. Now, I have heard that there was the incorporation of the little cherries on the curtain here into Grant Wood's Stone City wagon. I don't see that in the image, but if anybody knows more about that and wants to share a story, I would absolutely love to hear more about that. But in any case, we do have the same curtain. And when I did an exhibition about Theater Cedar Rapids and included some information about Grant Wood, I heard this fantastic story that Grant Wood said if he didn't succeed as an artist, he would have gone into theater and potentially been an actor. So I'm very concerned about who was dishing out career advice to Grant Wood at that time. But I found that to be fascinating and also quite a funny story. This is another example where Grant Wood, I think, is poking fun at folks, but he's also kind of a member of the club. So this is Shrine Quartet, painted in 1939, created in 1939. And we do know that Grant Wood was a Mason. Now, not for very long, and eventually he was kicked out for failure to pay his dues. But in order to be a Shriner, you have to first be a Mason. And so while Grant Wood was not a Shriner, he was a Mason. So he at least saw some value in this organization and had been a member of it for a time. So this is a membership card that is in the collection of the Iowa Masonic Library and Museum just across the alley from us here at the History Center. And we do have a copy of this on display in our exhibit, along with Shrine Quartet, which is also on loan from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And then, of course, we have the Cedar Rapids Corn Song. For those of you who are on TikTok, I really recommend finding Joe Coffey's TikTok about this. He hires a musician who actually plays the song. And so this was a corn song that was created as part of the Elk Temple, so by some Shriners. But Grant Wood did design the cover art for the Cedar Rapids Corn Song. And while there's some element of being serious included in this, I think there's also some levity. Like at the very end of the song, you're supposed to strike your chest twice. So I think they're being a little bit goofy. And then there's a whole explanation about the club and the importance of it over time. Now, the part of this exhibit that Grant Wood would probably like the least, were he able to see it, is about the Great Red Flannel Underwear Quest. In 1935, Grant Wood placed an unusual advertisement in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. He asked for a large pair of worn red flannel underwear, the old-fashioned type that farmers once wore in winter. He wanted them as a prop for a new painting he planned to call The Bath 1880. The scene was meant to show a farmer on Saturday night pouring hot water into a wooden tub for his weekly bath. By the 1930s, red flannels were out of fashion and hard to find, so Wood turned to the public for help. Surely someone had a pair of old flannels that they would lend him so that he could create this painting of a farmer and his union suit. Well, the request brought him national attention, and people teased him in the newspapers across Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. Still, Wood continued searching. The underwear had to be large because he had already chosen the model he needed, and that pair had to fit his chosen model. In time, a family in Minnesota sent him a nearly new set that they had received from relatives. Wood paid them $10 for the garment and hoped that he could finally begin painting. The strong public reaction may have changed his plans. Many people believed he was only doing this to gain publicity. With reporters joking about the search, Wood decided not to create the Bath 1880 after all. His career was growing quickly at that time, and he did not want this attention to overshadow his more serious work. Even though the painting was never completed, the idea did not completely disappear. Parts of the planned scene show up later. Red flannels appear in Midnight Alarm, and a farmer bathes outdoors in Sultry Night. These works suggest that even when a project did not work out, Wood found a way to use pieces of an idea in something new. So I wouldn't necessarily say that any of these works are humorous in themselves, but it is a little bit funny that this newspaper ad that he placed turned into such a huge ordeal to the point that he ended up not creating the artwork. And I did find the original advertisement that was placed. So that's this one down at the bottom from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Wanted, large pair, man's red flannel underwear, must be authentic. Grant Wood Studios, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And there are some slight variations. He ran this ad many times over the years. So sometimes he included a phone number, sometimes he included a few extra details, but the gist of it was pretty much always the same. And then you can see how many other newspapers picked up this story and sort of the funny headlines that were created. Iowa artist on futile hunt for scarlet undies. Uh, so people are just kind of poking fun at him, less so than this being his humor, than people perhaps being a little bit mean in the way that they were making fun of him at this point. There are a handful of other items that are on display, which I will get to pretty quickly here. So we do have They That Mourn, which is a play that Grant Wood wrote in collaboration with Jewel Bothwell-Tull. And it is, I can't say that it is autobiographical. There's no real evidence to suggest that. I can say that Grant Wood was married in March of 1935, so he really had not been married to his wife, Sarah Sherman Maxon, for very long when he wrote this play. And it is about a carefree, easygoing guy who is married to a woman who has taken care of him and made sure that he had what he needed and was potentially a little controlling in doing that throughout his life. And upon her death, everyone feels very bad for him because how could he possibly take care of himself now that she is gone? And throughout the play, the man is mostly thinking about how what he would most like is to buy a bicycle, and he is excited at the prospect of being able to ride a bike, which is something he has not done in a good many years. So this is only a 3-page play. You can read the first 2 pages of it on display at the History Center, but it is available in magazines and books. So this is something that you can find if you're interested in reading a very short play written by Grant Wood. This is another just signature page that Grant Wood wrote, incorporating a line from the art building at the University of Iowa. Now, this is not their current art building. I think they still refer to it as the old art building, but he uses the language that is on the outside of the building and then writes whatever that means and then signs here. The translation is something like art endures, life is short, or skillfulness takes time and life is short, depending on how you interpret the language there. So he is sort of poking fun at the seriousness of this quote and artists taking themselves somewhat seriously and then pretending not to know what that really means. I also love this creation of Grant Wood's and Marvin Cone's, where Grant Wood created malnutrition as a portrait of Marvin Cohn, and then Marvin Cohn painted Overstimulation as a portrait of Grant Wood at the same time. And then Marvin Cohn sort of continues to have other iterations of this artwork throughout his life. Unfortunately, Overstimulation burned in 1932, and so it doesn't exist anymore. But they created these portraits of each other in 1919. I believe the story is that they were supposed to be painting outdoors and it was raining. And so instead, this is what they created. And I think there's a joke here about the starving artist with malnutrition, and then with Marvin Cohn sort of shooting back and painting Grant Wood as larger than he really was and calling it overstimulation. So the two are just being a little bit goofy, but also creating some spectacular portraits of one another. And then I just have a handful of other photos, and I know we're close to the end of the time, so I will kind of race through these, but you can't tell me that Grant Wood and John Stewart Curry are not just having a good time giggling here in 1933, with both of them wearing their overalls, and then, of course, the door to the Grant Wood studio where he has created this clock about all the places that he could potentially be using the lid of a coffin to create that door. So please do come see us at the History Center. We have a handful of other items that I didn't have a chance to talk about, and I would absolutely love if you would come visit us and see the exhibit in person. And I will stop sharing in case anyone has questions.
Thanks so much, Tara.
Of course.
Let me allow people to unmute themselves. Okay, should be good. Any questions for Tara?
Well, I don't have a question, but I stopped in yesterday to see the exhibit. This is Ann Suggs, and it is really wonderful. You have done such a good job. I think that the displays are great, and there are also, you might want to mention that there are opportunities for people to get their pictures taken in, in the little no head things. Anyway, I thought it was great. Very good job.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to come see it. We do have a couple of stands like you would see at a carnival that Grant Wood works, but then the head is cut out so you can put your head in and take some photos of yourself in Grant Wood Works. And those are on loan here from Co-College, so they normally are in the library there.
There were multiple stories that you shared just now where I chuckled out loud um, as you were talking. But I was wondering, were there any stories or objects that you came across in your research for the exhibition that you didn't end up including, but you kind of wished that you could have?
Yeah, there's some things that just don't exist anymore, and there's some things that like we don't have the security to display them in the way that I would love to display them. So there are several works of art that I think are very funny that came out of the corn room at the Montrose Hotel. So there's things like the corn chandelier, and I have a cardboard cutout of it, but it's not the same as seeing the corn chandelier, or some of the original paintings of like boy milking cow and things like that that I don't even really know if they're supposed to be funny, but they make me laugh. And so we've incorporated some of those pieces into the exhibit, but there's just so many stories. Like the more I dig into Grant Wood, the more I think he just had a spectacular sense of humor. And I don't know that that always shines through as people are talking about his artwork. I think we are more serious about some of his artwork than he was at times, which is not to say that he didn't take it seriously, because I think he did, but I don't know how often he took himself seriously while he was creating his artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's so much about him. I think sometimes people go too far in the opposite direction where they like to think of him as being kind of a country guy, but he was so aware of art and art history and able to incorporate references to all of those things. But yeah, like you're saying, at the same time, definitely had a lot of those sort of winking nods there too, where he's being very humorous and satirical. So yeah, very fun.
I think there's lots of opportunities where he's like, if you know, you know. If you don't know, you have no idea what he's talking about there.
Other questions for Tara?
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate you guys.
I don't want to be a question hog here, but I was curious when you mentioned the portraits that Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood did of each other. I had never heard of that overstimulation, that combination of portraits that were done. Are there any are there any records of that portrait? Are there any photographs or I mean, I know it burned in the fire, but I would love to see that.
Brunel, Julia, does somebody know more about it than I do? I feel like I've seen a photograph of it.
Don't know that I've come across any images of that piece, but I don't. Renell, have you?
Hi, I'm gonna stay muted visually, but I will come in on audio here. Um, so I don't think I've ever seen a photo, but I do believe in Hazel Brown's book she discusses it. I think it's Hazel Brown's book, so don't quote me on that. But yeah, it would, this is what the catalog raisonné is on the hunt for, even not just the art objects themselves, but also archival material and stuff like that, hoping that someday we do come across that photo. So when we do, if we do, fingers crossed that we do, it will be shared for sure. But yeah, I can't recall seeing a photo, but just only reading descriptions of it. So, and even then, descriptions I don't think are that elaborate. I mean, it's in the tradition of artists to paint each other's portraits kind of as just as a training exercise, just as an art exercise for honing their skills. And but then when you throw those funny little titles on, it just I think gives us some insight into who those two men were and how good of friends they were and things like that. So, all right, that's what I'll share.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Renell. For those that don't know, Renell is spearheading creating the Grant Wood catalog raisonné. So she's been doing lots of research and digging in and finding pieces all over. So well, if there's no other questions, and I'm sure Tara welcomes questions if you think of them later and can reach out via your email, which I'm sure is available on the History Center's website. So make sure to go check out Grantwood Seriously Silly if you have not been yet. And remind us again when the exhibition closes.
It will be up through June.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tara. I so
Thank you.
appreciate you doing this for us. This was such fun. And thank you everyone for being here today and joining us for this Grantwood in Focus.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And goodbye. Hope you see us again. Come back again for another Grantwood in Focus or one of our other presentations. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.